What is going on, awesome peeps? Brent McCluskey here with Electrified Reviews, and today we are going to be talking about all things electric mountain bikes. This video is going to serve as an electric mountain bike buyer's guide. We're going to be talking about all the essential components, what we feel are the best components or the most essential components you want to be looking for a capable electric mountain bike. We're talking about, not just an e-mountain bike to go on, dirt trails. We're also not talking about a downhill racing bike, but, like an electric mountain bike where you're going to be going through some decent obstacles, stuff where you need control on the trails, something that's difficult enough where, you actually have to have real skill to be able to hit these trails. That kind of e-mountain bike, that's kind of the mindset that we're going to have while we're going to be talking about this stuff here today. And the bike we're going to be using as an example and to kind of show you some components is going to be this one right here, the iZip Trails. We have reviewed this bike before. We'll leave a link up here at the top and also at the bottom in the description if you want to check out that review. But the iZip Trails is a pretty good e-mountain bike that has some of the really essential components, some of the essential form factors that we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and dive into that right now. All right, awesome peeps. So when it comes to e-mountain bikes, there's definitely a handful of components, a handful of form factors that you definitely want to keep in mind. Stuff you want to check, like make like a list of things that you want, and to kind of check those off while you're searching for the e-mountain bike that you think is going to be best for you. One of the things that I want to start off with is going to be the pedal assist sensor. Okay, so there's two main types of pedal assist sensors that you can get. It's going to be a cadence sensor and a torque sensor. Okay, so here's the thing with a cadence sensor. Oh boy. Okay, with a cadence sensor, cadence sensors measure the rotation of the cranks, right? Those are okay, but the problem with cadence sensors is there's a latency that goes along with them, right? So there's a latency from the time that I start and stop pedaling to the time the motor actually activates and deactivates. And when you're on a technical trail where you need precision control, cadence sensors, they just really don't cut it. So one of the things that probably the most important thing you want to be looking for is an electric mountain bike with a torque sensor, because torque sensors measure the the torque, the pressure placed on the cranks. It takes something like 1,000 or thousands of measurements per second. It's a very precise feedback. There's like zero latency with that. And the cool thing about a torque sensor, which this bike does have here, is that there's a corresponding output of power, right? So if you are going up a small hill with a torque sensor, you're not going to be pedaling as hard, so the motor's not going to be spitting out as much power. When you hammer on the cranks, when you hammer on the pedals, you're going to be putting more torque on the cranks, and the motor's going to give you more power, right? With a cadence sensor, it's just on, off, on, off. That's all you get. It's just 100% or zero. So that's why torque sensor is really the way you want to go. There is a third one that you see every once in a while. It's going to be a smart sensor, which is basically like a cadence sensor and a torque sensor combined. Those are pretty similar to a torque sensor. In our experience, we haven't really seen much of a difference. So a torque sensor is good enough. That's what you're looking for, okay? As far as motors go, there's going to be two primary ways to drive your electric bike. We're going to have a hub motor here in the back, like we have on this bike, the iZip Trails, or you can have a mid-drive motor. So hub motors are typically what you're going to find on more of the affordable end of e-mountain bikes. The more money you put into this, typically you're going to start seeing a mid-drive motor, maybe around the $2,500, $2,000 price point. It just kind of depends. But so with a hub motor, some of the advantages of that is it's typically going to be more affordable. You're not going to be paying as much money. Sometimes you can get more torque out of a hub motor, but not necessarily. It just kind of depends. But some of the cons of a hub motor here is that you're not going to get any gearing advantage, right? Whatever, it's like if you have a mid-drive motor, it connects to the actual drivetrain. So just like on a car, we have same engine, but multiple gears. You can switch gears, and that motor has more torque and more acceleration in first gear than it does in fifth gear on a car. It's the same thing with a mid-drive motor on an electric bike. You're able to leverage the gearing of the rear cassette to really maximize the efficiency of that motor. So hub motor is okay, but really you want to be looking for a mid-drive motor. And another thing with the hub motor here is when you have a hub motor, look at where it's placed. The hub motor is right here. So this is what's called all unsuspended weight, right? This motor is going to absorb all the impacts of your trail. So is the longevity of the hub motor probably is not going to be as good in the long term as for a mid-drive, because if you have suspension on your bike, which we'll talk about later, the actual mid-drive motor will be on the frame and it's going to be suspended weight. It's going to be cushioned by the front suspension and the rear suspension if you have it. Another thing about the hub motors here is, look, they are in the back, right? And that makes the bike a little bit more back heavy. So something else to keep in mind is if you do have a mid-drive motor, not only do you have that mechanical or that gearing advantage, but it's also a lower center of gravity and it's also more centered on the bike. You know, imagine if this bike had a mid-drive motor and just imagine that weight being pushed forward a little bit right in the center, and it just makes the riding characteristics a little bit better. So do you have to have a mid-drive motor for a good e-mountain bike? No, you don't, but it does make things better. So that might be one of the components you might want to add to your checklist of, yeah, I definitely want this. So yeah, okay. Now for derailleurs, if you have a hub motor, the derailleur is not going to matter as much as it will on a mid-drive motor, but for an e-mountain bike, you want to be looking for a relatively good derailleur. You're probably going to want at least, you know, at least one upgrade from the entry level. This one is a Shimano Tourney. It would be nice to see an Altus, or honestly maybe even like an e-bike specific derailleur, because when you're on an electric mountain bike, you're going to be hammering through those gears a lot more. You're going to be flipping all the way up, all the way down, because you're going to be going through big hills, steep downhills, and you're going to be just flipping through that rear cassette. So having a better derailleur is good. But again, for the hub motor, not as critical, but when you start to get into a mid-drive, right? So imagine that the motor is right here, that's where you really want, it's almost absolutely essential to pair a powerful mid-drive motor with a very competent derailleur, because there's so much more torque and pressure being placed on that drive system, right? So another thing you want to look for if you do have a mid-drive motor is you want to make sure that the bike has what's called, I just love how this camera can do that. I love the DJI gimbal, is so dope. It just flips around like that. If you have a mid-drive motor, you want to make sure that that you have shift detection in there. So what that does is whenever you shift gears, it should cut power to the motor just for a split second, so you reduce the torque being placed on that drivetrain, on the derailleur, and hopefully increase longevity of the component. So if you do get a drivetrain and mid-drive, a couple things you want to look for that, like we're talking about, upgraded derailleur. You definitely want shift detection, so keep that in mind. For the battery for an e-mountain bike, this is another one of those things where it's not absolutely critical, but it's pretty important that the battery needs to be located where it's located here on the iZip trails. It needs to be on the down tube for a couple of main reasons. Primarily, it goes back to that weight issue. The center of gravity needs to be good. You don't want the bike to be off balance, because when you're navigating technical trails, you don't want to feel like the bike is really back heavy and kind of gets away from you, because sometimes you'll see the batteries on like a rear rack, or they'll put them silverfish style behind the seat post, and really you just don't want that for an e-mountain bike, especially if you have a hub motor. Because then all that, just again, we're putting so much weight towards the back there. If you had a silverfish style battery with a mid-drive, which you probably wouldn't, but if you did, that wouldn't be as bad, because the mid-drive motor is like 8 to 10 pounds typically. That weight keeps it low, so having a little bit back there wouldn't be that big of a deal. You also want to make sure the battery is locking and removable, because it's nice to be able to take the batteries, you know, like when you're on a long trail, like it would be nice to have a removable battery, because you want to be able to get back to your car, to your truck, whatever, and swap out the batteries if you have a spare. Also, when you are storing your bike, it's a good idea to have a removable battery anyways, because you can keep the battery stored separately from the bike itself, right? So you can keep the battery in a cool, dry location. It helps increase the longevity of the battery, helps keep the cells protected. It's just kind of the better way to do it. Another cool thing that I like to see on the batteries is a USB port. Because if you're on an e-mountain bike trail, 9 times out of 10, you're gonna probably wanna be filming it, right? You're gonna have a GoPro and some sort of filming device. And if the batteries get low on that, if you have a USB port on the battery there, it means you can use it as an actual like battery bank, right? Like a portable battery. You can charge up your device for a few minutes with the bike itself. You can keep filming, keep riding. It's just a cool thing to have. Something else I forgot to mention here as far as the drivetrain itself goes is when you have, regardless of whether or not you have a mid-drive or a hub motor here, the chainring needs to have some, I mean, really you should have some sort of protective case on the chainring. This one is a plastic chainring guard, so it's not gonna really do much in the way of helping to protect the teeth as far as like strikes go. However, this does keep the chain locked nice and tight in there. So if you don't have, you know, if you don't have a piece like this, hopefully you can find something with like a, you know, a chain guide on the inside. It helps keep the chain from derailing towards the inside. Preferably an aluminum or even like a steel bash guard on the outside of the chain ring, just to help protect the teeth there. Is it critical? Do you have to have it? No, but if you do get a strike, you'll definitely appreciate it when that does happen. Let's talk about tires here. For an e-mountain bike, I really think the best way to go is not fat tires. You're gonna want to have a bike that's probably 2.75 inches wide for the tires or less. And look, fat tires are fantastic. They really, really are. But the thing with fat tires is, number one, they are so heavy, so the centrifugal force really keeps that bike upright when you're riding, so it's kind of difficult to steer with them. And also they're so wide that it also makes it a little bit difficult to just to kind of control them, you know? So if your e-mountain bike trail has a ton of mud, or if you do live in like a really snowy area, sure, maybe you should opt for the 4-inch wide big old tires, but otherwise, you're probably gonna wanna have 2.75 inch wide or less, just because it makes it easier to navigate the technicalities of the trail. You definitely want to have also puncture protection in your tires. I don't know if these have puncture protection, but you really do want that. And on top of puncture protection lining, it's a good idea to put slime in your tires, because honestly, as you guys know, like one of the most frustrating things is being on a trail, getting a flat, having to stop and repair that. It just sucks. So if you can't, you know, if your e-mountain bike that you're looking at has everything that you want, but it doesn't have the right tires, okay, no big deal. Like, you can get those aftermarket, you know. Just keep in mind, like when we're talking about this stuff, a lot of it has to come from the factory, but some of this stuff can be put on afterwards. Like, let's say this bike was like pretty much perfect for you, but you wanted a higher and derailleur. Okay, well, you could just swap that out afterwards once you bought it. So the battery though, like if that wasn't in the right place, you can't swap that. The motor, it's not like easy to swap that. You can't put a mid-drive on this. So some things, they have to stay the same, but a lot of the time you can actually swap stuff out. Same as the suspension here. For suspension on a actual e-mountain bike, look, air suspension is obviously better. You definitely want air suspension if you can get it, but spring suspension is going to work pretty well also, as long, look, there's one caveat though. If you're gonna have spring suspension, you have to make sure that the suspension has a preload adjust and a compression clicker. You know, if you can have rebound adjust on there as well, that would be fantastic. But preload adjust, it just allows you to set how stiff the suspension is. So if you're on more technical trails, if you got more jumps on your trail, if you are a heavier rider, you can make the suspension stiffer. If you're a lighter rider, if you have a lot more like maybe like little bumps, you can you know, you can make it not quite as stiff, and you can adjust it on the fly just by turning that dial on the top of the suspension there. Now, as far as full suspension goes, do you need that? And I would say no, you don't need it, but it's nice to have. So when you're on a technical e-mountain bike trail, I mean, I guess this is kind of a preference thing for you guys, like, you know, it's just a preference thing, I suppose, but I don't think you really need to have a full suspension setup on an electric mountain bike. Now, if we're talking about downhill stuff, then yeah, probably you're gonna start wanting full suspension. But you know, whatever, it's a preference thing. If you want it, go for it, but you really don't have to have it here. Now, for the braking on e-mountain bikes, there's this kind of like, look, right now, e-mountain bikes or electric bikes in general, they're kind of on this trend of a lot of times we're just kind of putting, you know, analog components on electric bikes. And depending on how powerful your motor is and what the top speed is of your e-mountain bike, it's gonna kind of determine what you need for brakes, okay? So like right now, the brakes on this bike, the trails are Tektro mechanical disc brakes with 160 millimeter rotors. Now this bike only goes 20 miles per hour for the top speed. It doesn't have a throttle. And really the brakes here are like right on the cusp of needing to be upgraded. I mean, they're okay on this, but really what I like to see on a dedicated e-mountain bike is hydraulic brakes. And there's a big reason for that. look, these brakes work great in perfect conditions, okay? But as soon as you start getting into mud, water, or any sort of debris that gets on the rotors here and gets kind of like, you know, makes it more difficult for the calipers to grip, you want the hydraulic brakes because they have a lot more gripping pressure. You can really crank down on the hydraulic brakes, and that's what you want when you have mud on the rotors, to make sure that you can get this thing to like a full stop, right? Or control it on a big descent. So yeah, I would say at least hydraulic disc brakes up with 160 millimeter rotors. But you know, in a perfect world, again, depending on how fast your e-mountain bike can go, you might want to consider looking for a braking system that is hydraulic and has at least 180 millimeter rotors, maybe even 203, or if you really want to go for the gusto, you could do like 203 with quad piston, like Magura brakes, like top of the line. Because I mean, look, if you guys, for you guys who, you know, obviously if you're looking at this video, you probably already do some like pretty technical mountain bike riding, and as you well know, like, you gotta have good brakes. You have to be able to stop on a dime regardless of what kind of conditions you're in. So for me, the braking is really, really important. Okay, now, these brakes have motor inhibitors built in, so whenever you depress the brake levers, it shuts off power to the motor. Oh wait, actually these ones don't have it. Sorry, this bike does not have motor inhibitors, and the reason for that probably is because this is a torque sensor, so again, there's like no latency. But even still, I think it's a good idea to make sure that your e-mountain bike does have motor inhibitors, just because whenever you depress the brake levers, it shuts off power to the motor, and it makes sure that you have the shortest possible stopping distance. And again, when you're on like a serious trail, that's just, you want to make sure, even if you have a torque sensor with no latency, like I think it's very important to have the brake inhibitors and the motor inhibitors, right? As far as pedals go, that's kind of a personal preference thing too, and it's not that big of a deal because the reality is you can swap the pedals out for whatever you want. Same thing with the crank arms. If you don't like the crank arms, like whatever, you can swap those out. That's one of those components that's pretty easy to swap out yourself. But you know, I would say make sure that your pedals have nice grips on them. You get a good grip purchase. You just want to make sure you have good control. You can stay connected to your bike while you're riding it. For the frame itself and the weight, this is another thing I think is pretty important. You want to make sure that your e-mountain bike is not too heavy. You want to make sure it's probably going to be around 50 pounds. The heavier that your e-mountain bike is, the more difficult it's going to be to control this thing, right? The heavier it is, the more difficult it's going to be to flick it back and forth, to hop up over those rocks, whatever you're doing on your e-mountain bike. So I think, you know, making sure that the weight, the curb weight ends up, you know, clocking in at like 50 pounds or less. I think that's a pretty important thing too. As far as frame goes, that's gonna be kind of up to you guys. Like this is kind of a cool in between. It's not a step through, it's not a high step or a step over. It's kind of in between. It's like a middle of the ground. So, you know, it's easy to put your feet flat on the ground here, but it's got the dual bars, right? So it's got a very solid frame, and it's not gonna break apart when you're on technical trails. So step throughs are fine if you want that. I just think you need to make sure that you have the dual bars. Like you don't want to step through with just the single down tube that connects to the seat post. Like you need more than that. Like if you have a serious e-mountain bike, that's not going to cut it. So honestly, I would just, if you're looking at something like that, unfortunately for an e-mountain bike, you know, just X that out. Like it's not going to work. For the seat itself, for the saddle, I know a lot of you guys have talked about seat post droppers. I don't really use that much for e-mountain biking. And I haven't seen them that much on electric mountain bikes. Around the $5,000, $6,000 mark, I've seen a couple companies that do have seat post droppers kind of already installed with internally routed wires. But again, that's one of those things where if you really want a seat post dropper, which is not a bad idea, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, I'm just saying I don't personally really use them that much, but if you do want it, again, it's not a component that you really have to get from the company. You can get that aftermarket. Same thing with the saddle. If you just don't like it, I mean, you can put your own saddle on there. Yeah, there's a lot more you can go over. I really don't want to like overwhelm you guys with just like a ton of random information, but look, to recap, there's a few really important things here. Like for the ultimate setup, I think you're going to want a torque sensor. You absolutely have to have a torque sensor for your e-mountain bike. You're going to get so frustrated if you're on a technical trail and you have a cadence sensor and you're trying to go over a technicality and you stop pedaling, but with a cadence sensor, like it still goes for like a half a second or a second. It's going to start really frustrating you. The drivetrain or the motor, hub motor is okay. Mid-drive is really where it's at, especially if you're gonna be doing a lot of hills in your e-mountain bike trails, because again, it's able to leverage the gearing that you have on your bike. So if you can, I think the second most important thing is try to get a mid-drive motor, but anything with a hub motor is still going to work okay as well. It's just not going. It's still going to work. It's just not going to work as well. Derailleur, like we talked about, yeah, it's, you know, if you have a mid drive, it needs to be a better one. If it's a hub drive, not that big of a deal. The other thing, like I think is really important, is make sure the battery is located in the middle, guys. Like that's kind of a deal breaker for me. If it's not in the middle, it's just too much of a pain to even deal with. Look, and the reason is because, like, we have tested so many of these bikes, and the ones that are located in the back with a hub drive, like if you're riding on the street, honestly, it's fine, but they end up becoming so back heavy. They want to wheelie so easily when you have that configuration. So yeah, just don't do it. But really everything else I think is kind of like hot swappable. I'm just trying to give you guys like a good idea of the things that, you know, that we look for like what we would consider like a winning e-mountain bike, right? The stuff that's like absolutely critical, the stuff's going to make your ride more enjoyable. So I hope that this video helps to give you guys kind of a good breakdown of the different kind of configurations that you can have with an e-mountain bike. And look, if we forgot anything, or if you're like, hey, this is a really, like, to me, this is like really an important thing, let us know in the comments, like, what else do you think that we should add to this video? What else should we be talking about here for e-mountain bikes? Let us know in the comments. Let's have a conversation. Also, if you have any like specific e-mountain bikes that you guys have already tested and you're like, hey, this one is like, I'm telling you, this is like the dopest e-mountain bike, let us know too, because, you know, we review as many bikes as we can, but a lot of the bikes that you guys have or have tested or ridden, we haven't had a chance to review those yet, which is why we love getting comments from you guys in the comment section. So look, awesome peeps, I think that is pretty much it for this e-mountain bike buyer's guide in 2020. Again, I hope this did help you out. And if you do buy an e-mountain bike, let us know what you get so we can celebrate and be excited with you. Yeah, so that's it. Hopefully you are having a fantastic day. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.